Byron and Cherie got home late last night. So, assuming they'll be back next week.
This should be.
And good to have them back with us. So, we're going to continue what we started last week. Last week we started talking about fossils and transitional forms and how that relates to what God's Word has to say. And so we're going to kind of review a little bit as we get started and then dive into kind of the end of that section and that lesson and dealing more with what do we actually see out there and what actually has been used as evidence for transitional forms, supposedly, or what we call missing links at times. And are those actually authentically transitional forms? Because if they are, then us meeting here, us worshiping here is completely pointless, because very clearly that the Word of God is then false. There's no point then in studying this. There's no point in me being here. There's no point in Myron teaching. There's no point in Pastor Caleb teaching if God's Word is not true. And that's what we ultimately, that's kind of the point of all of this, is not to win a debate, is not to know science better than somebody else, but rather this is apologetics is really what it is. Okay, it's how do I know God's Word is true? What evidence is there that demonstrates, that shows that what God says happened actually happened? And so this is one of many different ways that we can do that. So I want to start us off again with looking at just a couple quick things as we review. The first, we opened up last week, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, with Romans chapter 1 and reading a section of that. And I just wanted to remind a small section of that. I think this is super important when you come to this. That really when you're dealing with unbelievers in any area, whether it's creation, evolution, whether it's anything else, because there are times, I think, in talking with unbelievers where something seems so obvious to us and they're just not getting it. And it's not an issue of eloquence of speech or the evidence that we've presented. It's an issue of that unbelievers are blinded and have a hard heart and a rebellious heart toward God. And apart from the Holy Spirit working in their hearts and softening their hearts and humbling them, the reality is what you or I say doesn't matter. That doesn't mean we don't need to be faithful to say and to teach what God has instructed us to teach. We do need to be faithful and make sure that we are communicating God's Word and we are making a stand for God's Word. But I also need to realize I can't unharden or unblind someone who is spiritually blind. I don't have that power. Okay? Only the Holy Spirit has that power. And so starting in Romans chapter 1, verse 18, it said, "For God's wrath is being revealed from heaven against all godlessness and unrighteousness of people who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth." And I'm going to stop right there today. I just wanted to remind us that what we're dealing with is not people who don't know the truth, but rather people who suppress the truth. And I think that's an important starting point, that all human beings have chosen in one form or another, some more blatant than others, and some have more knowledge than others, and therefore are more blatant in their suppression and in their disobedience of the truth that God has revealed. And as this passage goes on, God clearly states, I've revealed myself through creation. You cannot take a look at what is out there and walk away and say there is no God, that there is no creator. It is evident. And as a matter of fact, that's what this passage goes on to say, is that God has made it evident to them so that they are without excuse. And so when we deal with this concept of creation and evolution, that's really the nuts and bolts of it, is God has made a world where people are without excuse, And so when people deny him, or they claim, well, science says this, it has nothing to do with science. It has everything to do with a hard heart that is unwilling to see and wants to suppress the truth. Because the truth means they are not in charge. They are before the Almighty God of creation, and they are not the Lord. The Lord is the Lord, and they are his slave. That's what that would mean. And it would require obedience and a change in lifestyle more often than not. So, that being said, let's hop into kind of what we talked about last week. Is really you have two models or two worldviews in looking at evidence that we see out there. And we look at the same evidence. We're not looking at, well, here's all the creation evidence and here's all the evolutionary evidence, and they're two completely sets of evidence. No, it's the same evidence. We look at the same fossils. Okay, we look at the same rock layers and things like that. But we have two different worldviews, and because of those two different assumptions about things, then we're going to interpret things a little bit differently. So when it comes to science, you have to build models or predictions. What should happen if what I believe is true, and this is part of that scientific method, I think this. Therefore, if this is true, this is what I should see, or this is what should happen. Okay, now we can't experiment with this. We mentioned that this is not observational science. Okay, this is what we call historical science. I know that's something that happened in the past. It's a one-time event. It's not repeatable. It's not something I can do in a lab. So I have to take with what I can see and then build a model or a prediction off of that. And so we said for evolution, what we would predict in terms of the fossils and the fossil record is that you would have many fossils due to long ages of burial of dead animals. If supposedly hundreds of millions, actually billions of years, okay, have gone by. Specifically, if you're talking about life here on this earth, about 1.5 billion years, roughly speaking, of life from single cellular organisms to mankind. All that time you have lots of things dying, and some of them would be buried and fossilized, and so we should see evidence of that. We should also see many transitional forms in the fossil record as animals, creatures, plants moved from one form to another form. We should see that slow, gradual transition. And we're going to take a look at a couple of the supposed transitions in a minute here. And we would also find many extinct forms, because as one kind transitioned into another kind, again, that survival of the fittest, eventually that other kind becomes more fit to survive, becomes more fit and better able to adapt to its environment. And therefore, whatever that other kind was that it evolved from would slowly but surely die out and become extinct over time. That's the prediction there of that model. Creation, again, the assumption that there was a major, God created everything in 6 days and did that somewhere around 6,000 years ago, okay? Maybe at the most. Okay, if you accept some gaps in the chronology and the genealogies there, maybe at the most 10,000 years ago. But we still believe, okay, that the Bible teaches us there was a major, major catastrophe that happened where lots and lots of things died and would have been buried fairly rapidly. And so that's where we're going to find most of our fossils from. We don't see a lot of fossils forming today. But there would have been an event, a one-time event, that would have formed, would have been catastrophic, would have caused billions and billions of dead things, plants, animals, and there would have been a lot of sediment and upheaval that could have buried all of that, along with a lot of the minerals needed to cement them into fossils. So yes, of course we would have fossils, not due to long ages of time, but rather due to one cataclysmic event with rapid burial. It would also predict there's no transitional forms because God created everything according to their kind, and then when the flood came, it buried them according to their kind. And so we would expect to see groups of creatures and plants, but they would be very distinct in their kinds. We would not see slow gradations from one creature to another, or from one plant to another. And then we would also expect to see some extinct kinds, not because necessarily of survival of the fittest in the same way that evolution talks about, but rather due to climate change. After the flood, there apparently was some severe climate change and alteration to the planet, and as a result, some animals, particularly your large reptiles, that we would refer to as dinosaurs, would have had a much more difficult time living in a cooler environment after the flood, and ultimately would have gone extinct, among others. So those are the predictions. So then, once you have your predictions, then you go through and begin to, okay, well, what do we actually see out there? And which model fits the predictions, okay, or which model's predictions best fit what we see in real life, okay, in observational science that we see. One of the things we mentioned last week was the idea of the geologic record, which is completely artificial, that you see drawn in books. It's based off of an evolutionary assumption that you have your lower life forms at the bottom and your more advanced life forms, with humans being at the top, and this slow evolutionary process of what we find in the geologic strata. And we said that's not actually what we find there. While we do tend to find quote-unquote lower life forms at the bottom, sea-dwelling creatures, that's because they lived in the sea, which was lower. And as you had the upheaval of flood or whatever, they would have gotten buried first. So there's a very logical and scientific explanation for that. But the flip side to that is not all of them were buried in that order. And so what do you do when you find sea-dwelling creatures, especially supposedly primitive sea-dwelling creatures, buried towards the top of that geologic strata? How did they get there? That becomes a difficult question for evolutionists to answer. So today what we're going to talk about, and should be able to get us out a little bit early today, maybe that'll make up for some of the times we've gone a little bit long, is we're going to take a look at transitional forms, or what is sometimes referred to as missing links. And really the only thing missing about missing links is that they're still missing. That's really, honestly, the truth. I don't know for how long they've been called missing links, but there's a reason they're called missing links, is because they're missing, okay? If we'd actually found any transitional forms, we wouldn't have to call them missing links, because we would have found them and, oh, see, evolution is true. And so we can discard this whole Bible thing, we can discard this whole creation thing, all those people, silly people who follow after that. It's a ridiculous myth. But creation still has an argument, because there is a lack of these missing links. They are still, since Charles Darwin admitted that, hey, the fossil record really doesn't support what I have to say, but I know as time goes on, we're going to discover more and more fossils, and that's going to support what I have to say. Except now, 150 plus years later, we still haven't found those transitional forms. And we're going to go through some of the supposed transitional forms, some of which have made their way into textbooks and been pointed to as, oh, these were very clearly evidence. And then since then, well, maybe not so. And again, the maybe not so is not necessarily evidence that's been researched by creationists. It's evolutionists taking a look and kind of, well, you know what? This really isn't what we thought it was. This is just this over here, or this is just this over here. And a lot of times it comes down to, we so desperately need and believe and want to believe in evolution, we have to have a transitional form. And so we're going to say this is a transitional form, even though we really haven't taken the time to do the research and the science and the study as to what it actually really authentically is. And that's one of the dangers in this. One of the dangers we mentioned last week is we don't typically find a lot of fossils, particularly of your vertebrates, that are complete and whole. You know, more often than not, you find a piece here and a piece there. Sometimes they're found a year or two or multiple years apart from one another. And so how do you know it's to the same? And so there is some guesswork in there. And that's part of what science does. Science is about, well, we found this, we're not sure what it is, so we think this, and then going back and correcting mistakes, and that is part of science. Okay, both creationists and evolutionists make mistakes and have to go back and refigure things, and well, okay, we thought this, and nope, this is what it is over here. But you also have to be careful that if I'm making an assumption based off of a fragment of something, where do I go with that assumption? Okay, am I treating this as proof when really I don't know? And I want to be real cautious of that. So we're going to look first at non-human transitional forms. There should be all kinds of transitional forms for both plants and animals, from one-celled creatures to multiple-celled creatures. There should be transitional forms for things, you know, even your earliest invertebrates that did not have any kind of, you know, for example, an eye. Okay? How did you go from something that didn't have an eye to something that did have an eye? Okay, and you know, so even transitional forms of just certain organs that we have. So not just even kinds transitioning from one kind to another, but transitioning from not having this organ to now having this organ. And so that's a whole nother conversation as well. And we're not going to get as much into that, but I did want to kind of mention that because this conversation goes far beyond just going from some kind of fish to that fish somehow being able to walk and being able to breathe on land and somehow eventually crawling on land, and now you have some kind of land creature kind of thing, that transitional type form there, or some kind of reptile transitioning into a bird or something like that. But even more, you know, so like we mentioned, the eye here, where did the eye come from? And whatever creature, that transitional form, as it's developing this, what we now think of as an eye, the eye is incredibly complex, okay, in terms of, it is one of the most complex organs in our body. It is amazing in terms of its structure. Well, how much time would it have taken to develop, supposedly, slowly, over time? And keep in mind kind of what we mentioned last week, that at least for a while, that eye would have been completely useless. And so what advantage would that, whatever it was, have had as that eye developed? Well, none. Matter of fact, if anything, it probably would be more harmful than it would be useful. And so you begin to have problems here as you talk about these transitional forms where really in the midst of this transition, it's not actually useful. It's not actually a functional advantage. And evolutionists like to talk about that functional advantage, but the problem is they can't really pinpoint where that functional advantage is or what that functional advantage would be as something is transitioning from one thing to another. I can say, well, once something is a bird, okay, is it a functional advantage to have wings, to fly over larger areas of territory, to hunt down prey? Okay, I could definitely point to that as a functional advantage. But in between, when it sort of has wings, but those wings aren't really functional yet, well, okay then, what's its functional advantage? Matter of fact, actually none, because now it's got these wings that aren't really legs anymore, so it can't really run away from, you know, any predators as well, but it can't fly yet to escape the predators. So now it's actually a functional disadvantage, and is more harmful to the creature. And so what ends up, I'm making up fictional advantages that really don't exist without pointing out all the disadvantages that would be along the way. So we're going to look at a couple, and we don't have time to look at all of them. Is this going to work for me here? Oh, it wants to be cranky. Okay. Did we freeze up? There we go. Okay. The first one is fish to amphibian. And one of the most famous ones is a fish that was known as coelacanth. And I'm going to show you a picture of the fossil in just a second here. And for many, many years, this was taught as a extinct fish, okay? And it looked different than other fish. It had some different features, they thought, and it had some fins that were kind of on the bottom. Now, bear in mind, everything that they were basing their belief system off of was a fossil, okay? So this is not actual fish that we saw and observed, okay? But the assumption was, because of the location of the fins, it was different than other fish that we had seen before, and therefore, because the fins were kind of closer to the bottom, they must have used these fins for kind of walking on the bottom of the ocean floor, and that of course was evidence that this was kind of a precursor to growing and developing legs, which of course is obviously in the evolutionary chain, so this was very clearly a transitional form. Now bear in mind, everything about it was fish-like, but the assumption was, based off of the fossil, they assumed that these fins that other fish did not have, since they were close to the bottom and used for walking. Not that we actually observed this fish walking, but it was an assumption, and again, based off of, I need a missing link between fish and some kind of amphibian type creature that is able to move on the land. So, I came across this fossil, it's different than other fossils, this must be what it is. Here's a picture of the fossil. Okay, why is my mouse not working? Oh, okay, now it's gonna work. Back up. Okay. Okay, so here's the original fossil, okay, that they are studying and making their thing off of. And then this is a living fossil, okay? And what they actually did is in 1938, they actually found not one, but a whole group of coelacanths living and alive. Just a fish that we had not found. Again, because the ocean is so vast, there are things there that we don't necessarily know are there. And in 1938, we found live coelacanths. And so we were able to actually study them, and guess what? They didn't use those fins for walking on the ocean floor at all, okay? Rather, those unique fins on the bottom were used for maneuvering, okay, through the water. That's what they were used for. And so, even though this had been pointed to for many years, scientifically it was then shown that no, this is not a missing link, okay, and despite the fact that this has been pointed to, put into textbooks, okay, and things like that, and shown that, oh, clearly this is a missing link, all of a sudden science comes along and shows, no, not really. Not a missing link, yes.
Have they tried to say that these aren't the same fish?
I never heard that they tried to say these are not the same fish.
Okay.
I think it was pretty clear from both the fossil and these were the same fish they had been studying, or that the fossil was from.
With today's way of thinking, I could easily say this is not the same fish because, you know, he's bent at a weird angle and all. I just could see them just denying what's obvious.
I don't know how they transition, you know, obviously him being fossilized in the midst of a, you know, catastrophe, you know, the body being bent or broken. I would assume they have ways of kind of straightening that out and studying it there. You know, I'm not a paleontologist, so, but they were able to see that this is the same fish that they had been studying, same features, same body type, and no, it was not. Okay, so that's one of the famous things. Here's another statement that is made. It says, because birds are dinosaurs, dinosaurs have not died out. Nevertheless, dinosaurs are still alive and very successful. Birds are the direct descendants of small meat-eating dinosaurs, and in modern biological classification are considered to be a subset of Dinosauria. In this sense, dinosaurs are still very successful because there are more than 8,000 species alive today. And again, this is based on an assumption. This statement is based on an assumption that because of the evolutionary chain, I know that, okay, how did we get birds? How did we get man? Well, before birds and before mammals, you had reptiles dominated the earth. And so somewhere along the line from reptiles, there was kind of two branches. One of those branches went off into mammals, and the other branch went off into what we now know as birds. So obviously, clearly, birds are descendants of dinosaurs. You even see this concept in the Jurassic Park movies. They very much kind of push this idea, particularly with the velociraptors, and their great ability to supposedly jump and leap. That's part of their slow evolution to becoming some kind of bird-like creature, or whatever. And that philosophy, I noticed something, I don't remember if Wendy mentioned it last week or not, but in Highlights magazine, if you've ever had kids with the Highlights magazines, in recent years they've started putting a lot of, every now and then, dinosaur section, in there. And more, the coloration of those dinosaurs and even the scales they have on there hint at some kind of feathery, bird-like coloration on it. And the reality is this: from fossilized bones, do we have any idea of what their scales look like or what color? Not at all, okay? And so anything like that is complete conjecture and fantasy, really. And so, but when you put it in a book and you give it to a 5-year-old, or a 6-year-old, and they're like, oh, dinosaurs, yeah, this, I know what, a T-Rex or what this looked like, and here it is, and we're indoctrinating kids with stuff that is really nothing more than fantasy literature, okay, and giving them false views and false ideas of what is actually true. Okay, so we had the coelacanth. Reptile to bird is another big one, and probably the most famous, and this has been found, and sometimes today is still found occasionally in biology books. I can't remember, was it found in your guys' biology book? When you guys were, okay, so even as recent as my kids going through high school, it was found in their biology book that they used, and that was just a couple years ago. So this is one that is really, really pushed and interesting, and this is Archaeopteryx, and it's a fossilized bird, and some of you might recognize the fossil of it here. This is the fossil of Archaeopteryx, and there's a couple unique features about Archaeopteryx that people really, really kind of pushed the view of it being an ancestor, okay, or a missing link, or some kind of transition between reptile and bird. Clearly, it's some kind of bird-looking thing, but it had a couple features that most birds do not have. One of which is that it had teeth, kind of like a reptile, since a lot of reptiles have teeth. So that's kind of unusual for a bird to have. The other thing that it has, and I don't know if you can quite see it in this photo of the bird, but right here, I'm trying to see where it is, I think it's right here, or no, maybe it's right here on the wings, it has claws, okay? Which again is unusual for a bird, and so I'll try to, I think I have a artist rendition of it. And again, this is an artist rendition. This is not like we've actually seen these in nature and observed them and oh yeah, here they are. So this is an artist rendition of what they look like, supposedly, and it had these little claws here. So evolutionists took that and said, oh, well, claws on a bird, that's clearly kind of the leftovers from a reptile as it, expanded into wings, and it, left over these claws that it used to crawl on the ground, and obviously teeth, in its mouth. Well, that is obviously and clearly something left over from it being a reptile, because birds don't have teeth. And so very clearly this is a transitional form. Several evolutionists, who were experts in birds, did a study on Archaeopteryx, and ultimately, after several years of studying, came to the conclusion that there is nothing reptilian about Archaeopteryx at all. It is simply an extinct bird, is all it is. And you can kind of use some of their logic and go backwards on that, because there are reptiles that don't have teeth. So did they evolve from birds? Well, that doesn't work in the evolutionary chain, because the evolutionary chain, of course, and very clearly, birds evolved from reptiles, not the other way around. But wait a minute, there's reptiles without teeth, so did they evolve from birds without teeth? And so if I'm using that line of thinking, it's a flawed line of thinking. Okay? And it's based off of an assumption. Yeah, Kevin?
They also then discovered bird fossils dated earlier than this, which is a problem if this is supposed to evolve into birds, if there's already birds.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to talk, there's another instance where they had that kind of similar situation, where again, what I'm assuming it evolved into, I find something that's dated, closer to this time period. And so yeah, it becomes very problematic for them. And so even though this has been proven to be nothing more than an extinct bird, it still appears in textbooks. And so even though it's been proven this is not a missing link, this is not a transitional form, it's still pushed as such in textbooks and sold to our children as this is true, and here's evidence, when it's actually not evidence. Okay? It's actually the opposite of evidence. It's evidence that you have an extinct bird, who died sometime after the flood, and no longer exists. I don't know if you recognize this. Okay, but supposedly we're related to him, according to evolution. And so one of the many branches of evolution is that mankind kind of took at some point a branch off of the ape-like tree. And you got to be careful here. We can't say monkeys, because evolutionists will be very specific. It's from the ape-like ancestors. And somewhere along there, humankind began to branch off and take a different turn in terms of mutations, and apes kind of went a different direction. So we have the ape group that we have today, and we have humans who went in a different direction and slowly began to evolve and become more advanced, and so on and so forth. So we're going to look at what some of those supposed transitional forms and how we supposedly got here. So we'll look at some pictures first, kind of what the branch is. So when I'm talking about branches, you can kind of see here somewhere, back there, some kind of ape creature that we descended from, and one branch went this direction into what eventually kind of became the gorilla family. Another branch went this way and then took a turn here, due to some kind of mutation, and we have the genus Homo, okay, which is where we ultimately get Homo sapiens from. And then along this way, there's supposedly a whole bunch of different branches of different evolution of people along the way, or ape-like ancestors, and eventually, of course, here we are as modern humans. And then a branch that did not branch off and mutate, and you get into chimpanzees and whatever else. Supposedly that's kind of the current view and the direction of how we evolved, supposedly. Okay, and then of course you probably saw things like this in textbooks, the supposed evolution of mankind, moving from some kind of more hairy, you can see the jaw-like structure there that's more ape-like, smaller cranium up here, smaller brain, more stooped, going from moving around on fours to more upright, and continuing that evolution. And you can see how the jaw structure and the brain capacity size is slowly, supposedly getting larger until you have modern man, supposedly. Now, all of those pictures, as great as they are nothing more than an artist's rendering of what supposedly happened. Okay, but they're treated as science. Well, this is clearly what we know happened. Well, the problem is you can't know it unless you observe it. Okay, if we're talking actual true science. I can believe something, sure, but I can't know it unless I can actually observe it and see it. So this is nothing more than a belief system, and unfortunately, there is not evidence really to support that this is actually what happened. I don't know if you remember the quote from last week from Stephen Jay Gould, but the idea that the only actual evidence we have of evolution, if we were to go back a little bit here, oops, wrong way, go back to our tree here, is he said, really at the tips and nodes of all these different branches that are on the evolutionary tree for all the different creatures that we see today, the only thing we have some fossils of something like this, and we have fossils and we can observe things like this, you know, here today. So this would be the tips and the nodes, but all the stuff in between is complete conjecture. So, and that's true of any, whether it be from fish to some kind of amphibian, reptile to bird, apes to humans, whatever it might be, the only actual evidence we have is like here and here. Everything in between is conjecture, what we think happened because we believe evolution is true. Well, if evolution is not true, then of course we're not going to find any of these. If creation is true, then none of this ever happened, and we have this, and we have this, which is what God said He created. And so we go back to here. I got a little overly creative on that one there. Okay. The first one that we'll mention is Piltdown Man. This is one that did appear in textbooks and was held up for many, many years, I believe all the way into the 50s, if I'm correct. Let's see if I put the date down here. Yes, until the 1950s. It was, quote unquote, discovered in 1912. It was not actually discovered. This was in the process as Darwinism was becoming more accepted, and more scientists had rejected God and you know, the age of reason and the age of science, and that had taken over from the Bible. And obviously, you know, for many years the Bible, you know, that was a crutch that people needed, but we're so much smarter now. Science can fix all of our problems. And once Darwin came along and gave them a way to reject God, a lot of people grabbed onto that. By 1912, that had become much more popular. But again, one of the big problems was, where are the transitional forms? And so one of the first big ones, particularly there were no transitional forms from any kind of ape like creature to man. And so one of the first ones was this Piltdown Man. And what it actually ended up being was a human skull cap, okay, the upper part, and a lower jaw of an orangutan had been chemically fused together and then stained to make it look old, okay, and ancient. And surprisingly, this fooled scientists for 40 years. Okay. And article after article, I think I have in here how many articles were written. Let's see here, if I put that in there. Yeah, 500 doctoral dissertations were written on Piltdown Man, and not a single evolutionist figured out that this was a complete hoax. And it took 40 years before they finally realized, oops, this is not actually authentic. This was a complete fraud. And all that time, like I said, doctoral dissertations had been written. It had been found in textbooks that this was clear proof that evolution was true, and yet it was nothing more than a fraud, all the way up into the 1950s. Yeah.
You would think after about the 200th one, they would say, you know what, this really looks like a different jaw on a human skull. But you know what, this can't be true because my pride would not let me be true because it's evolution. So you would think that maybe after someone along the line had some inkling this is not right, but
You would think.
Paleontology, industrial complex right there, money, power.
It's money, and I think
Grants,
part of it too is, and I don't even know if grants were as much into it during this time period. I mean, nowadays definitely they would be.
Textbooks.
Textbooks, it would be an issue, but I think more it's an illustration of the blindness, and that verse we read, the willingness to suppress the truth. That I'm so blind and I so want to suppress the truth of God's word that I am willing to believe a lie and not even going to take the time to really scientifically investigate that it's true. And it is amazing that for 40 years this could go on. It's something so blatant. That is a huge black stain, I think, more so than the next one we're going to talk about, which is more of just kind of a humorous joke. But I think it's a huge black stain on evolutionists that really, to a large degree, has now been swept under the rug. It's not discussed. This is not mentioned in textbooks anymore. And it's as if it never existed. And it should be, if you promoted this for 40 years, this is something that should be mentioned, that, hey, we really, really screwed up here, and we need to make sure that we do better when it comes to authenticating these missing links. But instead, it's kind of been swept under the rug. Same thing with this one. Now, I will make this statement. This one did not quite get the same treatment of 40 years or whatever. This was kind of a quick one where discovery and, oh yeah, and then kind of, oh no, kind of thing. And that is Nebraska Man. The one the reason I bothered to bring it up, because of, basically it was a single tooth that was found. And it was discovered, I think, in 1920. I have the date somewhere here. Where did I put it? 22, I think. 1922 is sticking in my mind, is when it was discovered. And it was a single tooth, and the original discoverer thought, well, it has some similarities to that of a chimpanzee tooth, and began to kind of promote, well, maybe this is a link to, our ancient ancestors. And a couple people began to kind of run with it. And of course, the moment you said missing link, people began to run with it. And I'm going to show you a picture here. An artist in England, who also had drawn some other evolutionary stuff, took this and it was nicknamed Nebraska Man because the tooth was found in Nebraska. And so they drew this. Here's what I find amazing, and this is kind of the funny part of this. And while it was kind of a flash in the pan and wasn't really promoted the same way some of these others are, this artist managed to publish in a scientific journal this picture of Nebraska Man. And from one tooth, we got not only Nebraska Man, but his entire family and apparently how he lived and the tools that he used from a single tooth. Not sure how we got all that, okay? But again, you can see kind of how quickly that evolutionary philosophy turns something as simple as a tooth into fantasy world, really, okay? Yeah, right?
Nebraska doesn't have plateaus, mountains.
Camels?
Cameloids, you could at least argue they could have been the ancestors for the llamas that were down in Peru. But yeah, I'm just looking at the physical thing, like plateaus and mountains, and I'm like, they surely haven't been to Nebraska.
Again, it was an English artist, and I don't know. But this was published in a scientific journal. Shortly after that, it was discovered, oh, this is nothing more than an extinct pig. And then the whole thing was kind of swept under the carpet. But I do like to bring this one up, and while it did not make it into textbooks and things like that, I think it is worth noting that in a scientific journal, it was published, and not just the tooth, but what he looks like, and his family here, and it astounds you how far they're willing to go without any actual evidence.
Another thing I was thinking about, if we're related to primates, gorillas, chimpanzees, whatever, how come in the medical community, what do we use for testing to make sure drugs work or to see long-term things or anything? We use mice, rats, pigs, things that have similar organs or more similar organs to us. And I don't see anybody talking about, well, where's that pig portion of the ape line, or how did the mouse or rats get into
They would
the
be
equation?
they would be similar to us in that they're mammals,
Right.
In that sense. Beyond that, I don't know. And again, there are logical fallacies that go through all of this. Okay, the next one, and I always trip over this one, but Australopithecus. I'm struggling. Pitheces. Okay. This would be signs. This would be plural here. Yes. And this is one of the most common groups of fossils of ancient man, supposedly. And it supposedly is claimed, and if you saw on the evolutionary tree that we put up a little bit earlier, it is claimed to have been the closest common ancestor to modern humans, supposedly. However, okay, even evolutionists can't agree whether these were truly human ancestors, so they're kind of unsure, are these really ancestors of ours, or are they in a separate category? We don't know, but we need some kind of missing link, and modern CAT scans of the skulls show them that they are more than likely simply extinct great apes, okay, is what they were. And so this, again, this other category, there really isn't, some kind of in-between human and ape. It's everything that we see scientifically and medically that we're able to study shows them to be ape and nothing human. And so you can claim it's a transitional form, but there's no actual evidence that it actually is something in between. And again, a transitional form is not because I want it to be, it's there is something authentically that I can point to that shows that it is in between. Okay, yeah, Mom.
What did they find? Did they find a bone or something for this?
They found multiple fossils, but again, keep in mind when they find a bone or a fossil, usually they're only finding a fragment, okay? So maybe a piece of a leg bone or a piece of a finger bone or something like that. And then they try to piece all of those together to make something, whatever that might be. I want to say that I have it. Let's see here. Yes, and we'll get to her in a minute here, but if you have ever heard of Lucy, okay, Lucy would be in this category here. And she is probably the most famous example because she is the most complete skeleton, but even most complete, we're going to talk about how much was actually found of her in a minute here. Next one, Homo habilis, which translated means handyman. And again, so named because supposedly he was handy with tools. Now again, this is an assumption, not because we actually observed him walking around and utilizing tools and things like that. Again, modern CAT scans showed that whatever this was seemed to walk more like a baboon than anything else. And nowadays, most evolutionists simply regard this, the original fossils were just kind of part of a skull and some leg bones. So again, most of the skeleton was not there. As time has gone on and more fossils have been discovered, evolutionists have kind of gone to this category is now not really a category, it's a waste bin of all kinds of fossils that we don't know exactly what they are. And so this category has kind of gone by the wayside because what little evidence we do have of the original fossils seem to be more something similar to a baboon than anything else. And whatever other fossils we did discover that kind of got put in this category were kind of a conglomeration of this, that, and the other thing. So now this is kind of a waste bin of fossils of, we think it might be this, but we're really not sure. And so they get kind of dumped in this category. The next one is Homo Erectus, so named because this is upright man. One of the distinguishing features of moving from some kind of ape-like ancestor to humanoid is clearly the ability to walk upright and on two legs. And the main difference between the fossils they discovered here and the fossils of normal humans was their brain size. Seemed to be somewhat smaller than normal humans. However, that being said, there is a range of human, if you measure human skull, brain capacities, there is an actual range. This was on the lower end of the range, but it was still within that range. The assumption that evolutionists made is, well, because it's smaller, it must not actually be human, it must be something that was close to human. But the problem with that is, nothing else about the fossil shows any difference from a normal human fossil. Okay? And so, everything else is completely human in appearance, other than the fact that, okay, the brain, skull, and capacity seem to be smaller than our current average brain capacities. But again, it was still within that range. It was on the lower end, but it was still within the range of humanoid. And so, was there really any difference between this and humans? Apparently not. Okay. Next one, Cro-Magnon Man. And you've probably seen pictures of this one, but basically Cro-Magnon Man, any fossils that we have come up with and observed are indistinguishable from modern man. So it's basically modern man, but you know, they found a fossil of modern man and it was from ancient times. So we assume that because it's an ancient fossil, that it must be some descendant. And even though it looks exactly like modern man in terms of appearance, we have to assume, because evolution, of course, took place, that it was kind of an ancient ancestor who, you know, was kind of cavemanish like, you know, and me, ugh, you ugg it, we build fire, you know, kind of thing. You know, and that was the limit of his intelligence. But the reality is the fossil that we have is man. So it's no different there. Here's another famous one, Neanderthal Man. And I know some of you women might refer to all men as Neanderthals. My daughter is seconding that opinion right now. She thinks all men, which I'm okay with right now. She's away at college, it's fine. But Neanderthal Man is this idea, and it came from fossils that had some kind of bent over appearance. So you can imagine, you know, if you have fossils that kind of have this bent over appearance, right away evolutionists are going to latch on to, oh, see, this is something that was in the process of transitioning, even though it has basically a humanoid skeleton. Because it's bent over, obviously it still kind of, you know, walked occasionally on its, you know, knuckles, and kind of like from its ape-like ancestry. So this is very clearly a transitional form. It's mostly humanoid, but it hasn't learned to walk upright yet, and so it's clearly a transitional form. Well, as modern medicine and technology developed, we did some studies on these skeletons, and we found that most of these specimens suffered from something we call rickets. Okay? A disease we now know a lot more about, which one of the major side effects of rickets is a bowing of the skeleton, okay, like this, okay, and creating kind of a hunched look. But all of the other differences can be explained by very minor genetic differences that we would have between, you know, different races or culture groups or something like that today. And so basically it was a human skeleton that had rickets and was therefore bent over, that they didn't necessarily have a cure for back then, that now we know how to deal with something like rickets. And so, again, that's a situation where I'm looking so desperately for a transitional form, for an evolutionary explanation, that when I come across something that is very clearly humanoid and there's nothing ape-like about it other than the fact that it's hunched over, immediately my assumption is, oh, transitional form, see, evolution is correct, without taking the time to see and ask the question, why is it bent over? And actually do some research. And if it proves it's bent over because it is an actual, you know, that's how it was born, it was an actual ape-like ancestor, and we see some ape-like features here, okay, then we've authentically taken the time to research. But instead, claiming one thing and then having to backtrack and say, oops, you know, wait a minute, time out, you know, and then kind of looking like you got egg on your face, you know, from there. And unfortunately, evolution has a lot of egg on their face if they've claimed one thing after another.
Well, there's the audacity to go to like the Scopes trial in Ohio and to do that whole thing and then come away with that. That's very, very strange.
And I'll give them this at the Scopes trial, because it occurred so long ago, not as much of this evidence was known at the time, you know, so I will give them that much, you know, but afterward, as more things did come out, there should have been more people who kind of put the brakes on things, and more scientists who put the brakes on things and said, wait a minute, you know, this is a problem.
Well, it's even more interesting because due to the lack of evidence, they still went ahead like full steam. A reporter who was there wrote it and just said in his article it was a circus, and that's what it turned into.
Very much, and unfortunately, it's a circus that ended up turning kind of the tide and the views of the nation from being more pro-biblical viewpoint and worldview to seeing science, I should be careful when I say that, quote unquote science, okay, or an evolutionary atheistic worldview as the answer to things. It was very much the tipping point, and not that the rest of the nation, had believed in God, and then all of a sudden that forced them not to believe in God, but it was kind of a tipping point.
They gave them the spot
You know,
papers.
absolutely. And then we have one more, and we'll skip that here. Whoa, we went too far. And that is the one we mentioned, Lucy, who does actually belong in this group here. I put her separate because she is probably the most famous, still appears in textbooks. Did you guys have a picture in your textbook? I thought so. And this book that I have right here, this is an interesting one to read if you have a kid in school. Evolution Exposed, and I want to say there was another volume that was written of this. This goes through all of the popular textbooks that are used in high schools that are evolutionary in nature, and I think the one we use is right here on top. And
There's probably an updated version.
there might be an updated, even though this one said just updated when we got it, but it goes through all, and it has page numbers listed in here as to where you find the different concepts that are evolutionary concepts, and then it shows how to refute them, what is taught, and how to refute them, and what actually the scientific evidence actually is out there. I think this is a great book for kids who are in that situation to see, because you're going to hear things like Lucy. Okay, Lucy is probably the most famous fossil as evidence of supposedly between ape and mankind, and like I said, she is actually part of this group here, which we already mentioned is nothing more than an extinct ape. But here's the actual fossil that was found, and it's a 40% of the skeleton. So this is one of the more complete skeletons that we've found. But even in finding a more complete skeleton, you can see that we're still missing a lot of it. So this is a fairly unusual find, which is why it was such a big deal when it was found, because we did find so much of it here. But a couple things. One, we don't have much of the skull at all. The lower jaw is mainly what we have there, and the lower jaw is clearly ape-like. Okay, there's nothing humanoid about it. And then the supposed human-like features are the knee joint, which I believe is right over here, I think. But the problem with that is it was found a year earlier and 80 meters lower in strata and not with the rest of the fossils, so we're not even sure if it actually belongs to this particular fossil. So that becomes kind of an issue. The arm to leg ratio, apes are typically 1-to-1. Humans are 0.75 to 1 arm to leg ratio because we have a little bit shorter arms. Lucy's is 0.839 to 1. So this is one of the reasons they supposedly, it's right in between humans and apes. And so therefore, obviously, it must be a thing. But the problem is, Lucy's leg bone was broken and one end was crushed. So we really don't know if that measurement is actually accurate or not. And so it could very well be more likely a 1-to-1 ratio, which would again point to it being an ape. The left pelvis, the guy who discovered it says it was distorted. We only have one side of it here, but we don't know since it's the only one of its kind in existence. So what do we have to compare it to? You know, his it was distorted, and if it wasn't distorted, then it would be kind of in between this human and ape-like pelvis. Well, we can't say that it's distorted because what do we have to compare it to? There's nothing else, no other fossils that have been discovered like this that we would have to compare it to. Really, everything that we do have to look at seems to match either a pygmy chimp okay, or the Australopithecus category, which again is an extinct ape, okay, probably a chimpanzee of some sort that is now extinct. And so more than likely that's what Lucy actually is. There's nothing humanoid actually about Lucy, and yet it's still found in textbooks, and then you'll see things like this here. Again, and what students don't realize a lot of times when they see something like this, that most of this is actually false, okay? This is stuff that we've inserted to complete the skeleton, and that doesn't mean that it's inaccurate necessarily, because we can kind of copy, well, if this kind of looked like this, and I can come over here and copy, you know, the other parts of it. So there are parts of this that are actually scientific in completing a skeleton, but it is, anytime I'm completing something from stuff that's missing, it's like doing a puzzle without the picture and trying to figure out what it is. And so it's not as easy. And then of course, in museums you see Lucy finished a little bit more, and obviously the finished part of her makes her look something in between. Definitely she has ape-like features, but she also has some humanoid look to her as well. And so you can see how they take these things, and this right here, we don't know that she looked anything like this. Matter of fact, the only evidence we do have is that she was probably a chimpanzee of some sort, maybe an extinct chimpanzee. And so the claim that, oh, well, she's clear evidence of evolution, there really isn't any evidence there. And so really at the end of this, what we have is, why are we still searching for missing links today? Because they don't exist, because they are missing. And that shouldn't be the case 150 plus years after Charles Darwin, with the vast amount of fossils that we've uncovered, with the study of paleontology being as advanced as it is, with the technology that we now have at our disposal. We should have found thousands, if not millions, of transitional forms in the fossil record, and we still have authentically to find one. Now, there are a lot of things that different, creationists and evolutionists dispute about it. You can say are disputed forms, sure, because you have different worldviews, okay? But there's nothing that has been found that is authentically, and every year you get something that is found, and we found a little finger bone, and this is clearly a finger bone of some form that was part ape or part man, or it was this or that, and it's some kind of transitional form, and that claim is made, and then a little bit of research is done, and oh, really wasn't that, okay? And you have that happen every year. So there's always something new that's being proclaimed as transitional. Yes?
She was the skeleton was designated female. What led them to that?
I would assume the pelvis, typically, because the pelvis of males and females is definitely more distinct due to giving birth and child rearing and things like that. So, yeah.
So you mentioned 80 meters in the strata, and 80 meters is like what, 260 feet of dirt. That's like hundreds.
Huge.
That's hundreds, if not thousands, of years difference.
If you're assuming, uniformitarian,
right?
Yeah.
So that's in their own worldview. That should be maybe hundreds or thousands of years, and it shouldn't even be a question. And
I'm not sure why, or what. That is not raise a red flag, or what the assumption is there. I don't know if this particular layer of strata was that thick. So they're making the assumption that this particular layer of strata, it's all one layer, and comes from generally the same. That can be the only thing that I can think of.
Okay.
But if it was multiple stratas, that you're going through, now you have a major problem.
Right.
If it is all one big, huge, thick strata, you could make an argument that, okay, it is all from the same layer, but still you have a problem if part of the fossil's up here and another part's way down here, how can you even claim that it's from the same?
Yeah, especially if the
You know,
one is lower than the predominant of the rest of it. That if you say, okay, 10 meters higher, you found this random piece, that could make sense because an animal could have taken it, moved it, and it didn't get buried with the rest of it. But I don't know.
I'm just curious, how did they reach the one that was lower without reaching the one that was above first?
Well, you dig from top down, so you would have gotten the top, the
Right,
one that's on the
wasn't
top
that the rest
first.
of, isn't that what you're saying, that Lucy was on the top?
Yeah.
And
The
the one leg bone was at the very bottom?
The knee joint was,
Was-
yeah, found
Below all
below,
that?
yeah.
So how did they get to the knee first? The knee was found a year earlier?
No.
Yeah, it does say you're
It
earlier.
says
Oh.
a year earlier. And
That I don't
80
know.
something
That's,
lower.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah,
Um,
how did they get to the knee before they got to her?
I don't know, actually, on that one. I don't know. I know it's sometimes when they do paleontology,
Yeah.
they rope off
Yeah.
areas, like we're doing a dig here,
Right,
and then over here.
right.
Okay, so we
Yeah.
don't overlap, and and they mark very carefully what we find in each, they measure
Right.
out, this is
Right,
plot
so
one, plot
if the knee
two.
was right below the body, how
So-
did they go?
I don't know if they dug in plot one, and they'd been digging and they found the knee joint here, and then they moved over to plot two,
So it
and they
wasn't
found
even
more of the
directly below.
skeleton here, so
So we're saying that possibly it shifted somehow.
it could have, And again, that would be a semi-reasonable explanation if it was within relatively close.
Right.
It could be, oh, she died in a local flood and was buried, and
One of the.
as the body was broken apart, some of it shifted lower. But again, 80 meters, that's a big,
Shifts.
yeah, shift. So, that's where the questions, become. So that takes us through fossils in transitional forms. Next week,